Imagine you are standing on Long Beach under a blazing sun. People are spread out evenly along the shore, some closer to the water, some farther away, some sitting quietly, others walking along the sand. After a while, the heat sets in, and a scoop of ice cream would be great. You look around and notice a few ice cream sellers along the beach. Instinctively, you begin walking toward the one that is closest to you. This is pretty understandable. The farther you have to walk, the more effort it takes, and the less appealing the ice cream becomes. Of course, in real life, other factors may matter as well. Brand, flavor, or quality. The distance is often the first and the most immediate consideration. So from the consumer's point of view, the decision is simply to choose the closest seller. But economists approach this situation from a very different perspective. Instead of asking which ice cream seller the customer will choose, they ask a question from the firm's perspective. Where should the ice cream sellers locate in the first place? Each seller wants to attract as many customers as possible and maximize profit. How will they move around the beach? And how do their decisions interact with one another? At first glance, the answer feels obvious. We might think the sellers should spread out evenly along the beach, simply because they could avoid competing directly and minimize the distance to all customers. However, economic reasoning leads to a surprising conclusion. Instead of spreading out, competing sellers tend to move closer together, eventually ending up in the same place in the middle of the beach. This assumption aligns with reality. We see similar patterns everywhere. Gas stations often locate directly across the street from each other. Fast food chains cluster on the same docks. Even political candidates, despite emphasizing the differences, often adopt remarkably similar positions. Competition seems to produce clustering and similarities instead of differences and polarities. To understand this counterintuitive outcome, economists view models. An economic model is a simplified representation of reality. It uses assumptions, variables, and logical or graphical frameworks to explain complex economic behavior and make predictions about how individuals, firms, and markets behave. These models are not meant to capture every detail of the real world. Instead, they deliberately ignore many factors in order to focus on one key mechanism at a time. So here's the hoteling model, introduced in 1929 to study competition in situations where location affect consumer choice. Rather than analyzing prices, advertising, or product quality, the hoteling model asks a single question: how does location alone affect the firm's profits? To answer this question, the model makes several strong assumptions. First, the only thing that matters is location. Second, consumers buy from the closest sellers. And third, customers are spread out evenly along the line. Let's begin with the most simple case, a single seller. If there's only one ice cream seller on the beach, customers have no alternative. No matter where the seller stands, people will eventually walk towards them. At first, it may seem that location does not matter at all. However, once we introduce the idea of transportation cost, the inconvenience customer experience as distance increases, location becomes important. Customers farther away are less willing to buy. To minimize the average transportation cost faced by customers, the seller should locate in the center of the beach. From the center, the average walking distance is minimized. Even without competition, location already affects outcomes. Now, let's introduce competition by adding a second seller. Suppose the two sellers start far apart, perhaps one near the left end of the beach and the other near the right. Customers choose the closest seller, so the market is divided between them. Each seller clearly captures all customers on their own side, which is called the backyard. In the space between two firms, the customer will split at the midpoint between their locations. In this situation where two firms are symmetric in position, each firm captures half of the market. At first glance, this outcome looks stable and fair. Each firm has an equal share, and neither appears disadvantaged. But to determine whether this outcome can last, economists ask a crucial question: does either firm have an incentive to move? Consider what happens if one seller moves slightly towards the center. By moving inward, the seller keeps all of the original customers and captures some customers who were previously closer to the rival. This small movement increases the market share beyond 50%, and this is called market stealing. Now, consider the situation from the rival's perspective. If the rival stays in place, they continue losing customers. Remaining still becomes costly. The best response is to also move inward towards the center. This strategic interaction creates a back-and-forth process. Each seller responds to the other's movement. As long as one seller is closer to the center than the other, the one farther away has an incentive to move inward. Competition forces both firms to adjust their locations constantly. Eventually, both sellers meet in the middle of the beach. At this point, neither seller can improve the outcome by moving alone. This outcome is known economically as Nash equilibrium, a stable situation in which no player can benefit from changing strategy unilaterally. Because if one seller moves slightly away from the center, they risk losing customers to the competitor who stays in the same place. This equilibrium is not a deliberate choice. It is strategically unavoidable under competition. This result reveals a powerful insight. Competition doesn't always lead to differentiation. In the hoteling model, competition leads to sameness. Firms clustering together increases the average distance customers need to travel and jeopardizes their willingness to purchase. A strategically sound, stable situation may not be socially optimum as prescribed by the hoteling model. This logic helps explain the real-world patterns we mentioned earlier. Gas stations cluster near intersections to capture marginal drivers, fast food chains locate near competitors to avoid losing customers, and political candidates move toward the median voter to gain broader support. In each case, clustering emerges from strategic incentives. You may wonder that in real life, firms do not always compete on a straight line. Indeed, the two-firm hoteling model is the simplest version of the idea. In reality, there may be many firms competing along the street, or competition may take place in two-dimensional or more complex spaces such as cities or shopping malls. The geometry becomes more complex, but the underlying logic remains relevant. Imagine there are three sellers on the same street. Intuitively, you might expect them to settle into fixed positions, but in fact, they never truly do. No matter how the three firms position themselves, at least one of them can always improve by moving slightly. If a firm is in the middle, it gets squeezed from both sides. If it's on the edge, it has an incentive to move inward to steal customers. Because someone always wants to move, the market never fully settles into a stable arrangement. However, when there are four or more firms, stability can sometimes emerge, but only under certain conditions. Firms may end up pairing or clustering in a balanced way, where no single firm can gain by moving on its own. Whether this happens depends heavily on how firms are spaced at the start. With more firms, 5, 6, or 7, we often see a mix of clustering and spacing, rather than one neat pattern. The broader lesson is that competition is not just about individual behavior. The number of competitors and how they are arranged can determine whether a market ever becomes stable at all. This insight helps explain why some real-world markets feel settled, while others seem constantly in flux. At the same time, no economic model is perfect. Real consumers care about price, quality, brand, and personal preferences. Firms competing along many dimensions, not just location. These factors are deliberately ignored in the hoteling model to maintain focus. These limitations do not diminish the value of the model. Economic model analyze a small slice of reality to provide clarity and understanding. By isolating location as a strategic variable, the hoteling model reveals how incentives shape behavior in ways that intuition alone cannot explain. What begins as a simple story about ice cream sellers on a beach ultimately becomes a powerful framework for understanding competition. It is a simple model that offers a remarkably deep insight into how markets and strategies actually work.